YouTubers, welcome to my new YouTube channel, a new approach to modelling trees. And if you've just joined me for the first time, stay with me for this first chapter in modelling a tree like the one you see in front of you. Okay, let's get started. So this is the tree you saw in the introduction, similar to what we're going to be making in our next two videos. Now, the other tree in the introduction is a different type of tree. Both these trees will eventually be going on my colleague's layout. Now, for this first video, we're going to be concentrating on making the armature for our tree. Okay, materials. Probably the most important material, the one material you're going to be starting off with, is wire. That's wire I bought from various hobbycraft shops, but I didn't really get on with it, didn't like it. So in the end, I opted for single core cable, which I found a lot easier to use and obviously a lot cheaper. So the first job we're going to be doing is cutting our wire to the right length. Our particular tree in this video is going to be about 13 centimeters high, so allowing for the depth of the ply we're going to be using for our base. Cut your wire. This particular tree is only going to require 2 strands cut in. Next job is to extract the copper from the plastic sleeve. So grab your Stanley knife, cut a slit at the end, careful not to cut yourself. Gently tease out the copper. Once that is exposed, careful not to cut yourself, those ends can be quite sharp. Grab your pliers. Grab one strand at a time, don't try and grab them all and pull them out because you won't do it.
Okay, this is a last minute edit I've had to do to my video. The reason being is because there was one mistake I made while I was making my armature, and that was I left my cutting mat on the work surface. You'll notice in the next clips I'm using a heat gun while the cutting mat is still on the table. Big mistake, because what happened was I thought I had the heat gun far enough away from the mat, but as you can see the heat has buckled the cutting mat over there. So obviously these are very susceptible to heat. They do say don't leave them in sunlight. So if you are using a cutting mat, make sure it's removed from the work surface when you come to use your heat gun for this tutorial.
We're now ready to start making our armature. This is one I made before using heat shrink tubing, as you can see there. Those are our strands of copper we cut earlier on. This is the length of heat shrink tubing we also cut. So what we're going to be doing here is we're going to be creating the trunk of our tree. So we grab the strands of copper wire. Make sure that they're not too tightly packed into that heat shrink tubing, because we are going to be inserting more wire into that heat shrink tubing. So slide that on right down to the bottom, and you want to allow enough length of copper for the depth of the wood you're going to be using for your base. That looks okay. Next job, we've got to make the branches. This is one I made before. Just 2 strands of copper. So that will be inserted into the side of the tree, into the heat shrink tubing. So we just take 2 strands of copper, a small piece of heat shrink tubing, cut off about 4 or 5 mil in length. Insert the 2 strands of copper into the heat shrink tube. Decide how long you want that first branch to be. Now I'm using a heat gun here. As I said, it's a lot quicker using a heat gun as opposed to a hairdryer. Just be careful you don't burn your fingers. So that looks okay. That will be inserted into the side of the tree, going into the main heat shrink tube. We're now going to create a few more branches with more stems like the ones you see at the top of this armature. So grab your copper wire, make sure it's the same length as the other copper wire you used, so it's the height of the tree. As you can see, I'm using more strands here to create more branches. So we grab our heat shrink tubing. This is a larger diameter than the one we used before. Cut off a small length. Now this time the heat shrink tube can be a tight fit onto the copper, because we're not going to be inserting any more strands of copper into that heat shrink tubing. So flare out the ones at the top because we're going to be making more branches. So again, we're going to cut off a short length. Insert those strands into the heat shrink tube, so it's a nice tight fit. Again, we're going to be creating some more branches from the top there. Decide to make it a bit longer. If we find these branches are too long, we can always trim them off. So again, I grab my smallest piece of heat shrink tubing here. It's looking good. Now if you want, you can always add another branch coming out from one of the branches you've just created. Now I use darning needles for this, they're really good. So create a small hole in the side of your heat shrink tubing and just slide the copper wire in. So there you've just created another branch from one you've created. I'm happy with that. So like with the first one, I'm going to apply my heat gun to it. If you are doing this for the first time, and if you're using a heat gun rather than a hairdryer, it's probably a good idea to hold those copper strands with a pair of pliers so you don't run the risk of burning your fingers. So it looks like the heat shrink tubing has shrunk down onto the copper strands. Looks good. So what I'll be doing is I'll be inserting that into the top of the main trunk inside the heat shrink tubing. I'll probably have to trim off some strands from that to fit it into the heat shrink tube. As well as creating some more individual branches, we're going to need to create some branches stemming from the top of our armature like you see there. In a similar fashion to the way we created our second branch, we're going to be using different size heat shrink tubing, which we will apply to those strands of copper. Now that we've completed the rest of the branches, the next job is to attach them to the main trunk. And when you do attach your branches to the main trunk, try and make sure that the tree is looking symmetrical, so that not all the branches are coming out from one side of the trunk. And we do this by inserting the copper branches into the sleeve of the main trunk. That one's a bit too long, so I've just trimmed off the end. Decide where you want your branches to come out from the trunk. I think I've got too many strands of copper there to fit into that sleeve on the main trunk, so I'm going to snip a few off. You can always snip some more off if you find you've still got too many on there, but obviously leave at least one. So that should be enough. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to create a small hole in the side of the heat shrink tubing. I use darning needles, they're brilliant for this job. And just gently slide it in. Okay, so we've attached our first branch to our main trunk. And we're going to do the same for the other ones. Again, decide where you want those branches to come out from the trunk. Once we've decided that, we create another hole. I've got different size darning needles for this job, so obviously that one didn't need to be so large as the other one. I'm going to be using 2 strands here. And we slide that one in as well. So now it's probably a good time to tidy up the bottom of our armature. As you can see, it's looking a bit untidy there. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be trimming that so it's the right length, so it's no longer than the thickness of the wood we're going to be using. Just check it. Okay, that looks like the right length. So we're going to tidy up even more by twisting the end of the copper. Once we've done this, this will make it a lot easier when we slide it into the hole we've drilled in the middle of our mount. Now when you come to drill your hole to take the armature, make sure the hole size is slightly less than the diameter of the bottom of your armature. So when you do fit your armature into the hole, it's a nice tight fit and it won't fall off. There you go, ready to be mounted on our drilled mount. Probably think I've finished making my armature, but I decided I wanted to add another branch to my tree. So quickly created another branch. Now I don't think those 2 strands of copper wire will fit in the main heat shrink tubing, so I decided to cut one of the strands off. Decide where you want that branch to come out from. Grab your small darning needle, create a small hole in the heat shrink tubing, and slide that copper wire into the main heat shrink tube. Now you might find this a bit more difficult than before because we've got more strands of copper wire now in that heat shrink tubing, so it's quite a tight fit, but it should go in. Just got to persevere. Come on. In you go. Okay, that's it. I'm happy with that. Just going to reshape the top of the tree slightly before I apply my heat gun to it. Now we're going to hold the tree now, which is important, with a pair of pliers so we don't burn ourselves. And because I'm applying heat over the whole of the armature, not just the top, it's important that you hold the tree with a pair of pliers. Before, I was holding the branches with my fingers, but I was only applying heat to the top of the branches, so I didn't have to worry about burning my fingers. But in this case, it's important that you hold the tree with a pair of pliers. So you can see I'm going over the whole of the tree, right down to the bottom of the trunk. So if I was holding that bottom with my fingers, I would get a nasty burn. Okay, so once all the heat shrink tubing has shrunk onto the copper, you should be done. There you go.
Before we go any further, we're going to need to make a base to hold our armature, like this one here. This is what I'm using for this video. What I've done with this one is I've recessed in a rare earth magnet into the bottom that's held in with glue gun glue. You can buy these rare earth magnets quite easily on places like eBay. They're not very expensive. So once you've made your base, the next thing is to make the handle to hold your base. This happened to be a piece of round bar that was lying around in my materials cupboard. It was the right length, right diameter, so I thought, why not use it for this job? And as you can see, works really nicely, holds the base nice and firmly, and that base isn't going to fall off, and the base is easily detachable from your rare earth magnet. If you don't want to use metal, a cheaper alternative is to use wood. This is just a piece cut from a broom handle I purchased a while ago in a hardware store. If you do use a wooden handle, you're obviously going to need 2 rare earth magnets, so the second one would just be recessed into the top of your wooden handle. And the advantage of using rare earth magnets is, for example, if you wanted to make 5 bases with 5 different hole sizes, depending on what size armature you're going to be making, providing each base has a rare earth magnet attached to the bottom, you'll only need 1 handle. Also, if you are going to use wood, make sure your base size is going to be at least 4 to 5 inches square, so when you do use your heat gun on your base, you're not going to run the risk of damaging the top of your wooden handle. Obviously, if you're using metal, you don't have that same problem, but bear in mind that if you are using a metal handle and if you get too much heat on that metal handle, and you're not wearing a glove, you could end up hurting your hand. So it's probably a good idea, if you are using a metal handle, to make sure you're using a glove in whichever hand you're holding the metal in. The second option is to glue your base to your wooden handle. Obviously the disadvantage there is you can't detach your base from your wooden handle once it's glued in. And if you want to make, say 5 bases with 5 different hole sizes, you're going to need to make 5 handles. And finally, another idea I thought I had would be to use Velcro. These are called Velcro coins. They're self-adhesive. Again, needs to be obtainable on eBay. So these arrived in the post the other day. I thought I'd try them out for this video, thinking that they'd be a good idea. And as you can see, total failure. They're not very good, don't hold the base very well. So if you were thinking about using Velcro, forget about that idea. And finally, as you can see, I've got some other bases here. Now, these bases aren't used with a heat gun. These are primarily used for decorating the tree. This is a base I turned up on a wood lathe a while ago. It's nice to hold. And again, I don't use a heat gun on this. I don't attach a handle to it. It's just primarily for decorating my trees. So like these ones here, these are just offcuts. This tree hasn't quite been, needs finishing. These two have been finished. Again, they would have been originally on a base like this. So after I used the heat gun, I took them off and put them on a wooden base like this. Just offcuts really, with holes drilled in the middle. So purely for decorating my tree. So once you've finished making your handle to hold your armature, you'll be ready to proceed to the next step in making this armature.
Once we've made our base with the silver foil attached to protect it from the heat gun, we can attach our armature to it and start adding the glue from the glue gun to our armature. What we're going to do here is we're just going to attach it to the heatsink material, try and avoid getting it on those bare copper ends. So we're going to go over the whole armature, applying this heat gun glue. Now you're probably thinking, oh, it looks quite messy now with those blobs of glue, but when we use the heat gun on it, we're going to smooth out all those blobs of glue. So try and get a nice even coat of glue gun glue over the whole armature. Now that we've applied our glue to the armature, the next job is to apply a heat gun to it, making sure that you have a piece of material on your work surface to collect any hot glue that drops off your armature. There's a handle we made earlier on. It's going to come in handy now when we apply our heat to the armature. So we're going to go over the whole armature and remelt that hot glue that we stuck on earlier on, but making sure that it doesn't start dripping off the armature. That's why we're constantly moving the armature around, not allowing that hot glue to start dripping off. I've applied a bit more heat to the armature just to speed things up. So really, once that glue starts to melt, we're going to start manipulating where that glue starts to flow. Now, if we were to hold the armature in one position, what would happen is the glue would start to drip off. So that's why we're constantly turning the armature around, manipulating the glue, teasing it into different positions. Also, what we're doing here is we're making sure that the glue is also flowing down to the bottom of the armature. So at the bottom, it's going to be slightly thicker than the rest of the armature, like you can see on a real tree. So keep applying the heat gun to the armature. So that looks pretty good. Now we've turned the heat gun off, but that glue is still going to be flowing, so keep turning your armature. So what we're doing here is we're just sort of still manipulating the glue on the armature, getting it in the right position. That looks pretty good. A few blobs have occurred at the end of some of these armatures, so the glue's cooled down now. So what I'm doing is I'm just picking off those little blobs with my fingers, like you see here. So that looks pretty good. Next job is to spray the whole armature with some grey primer. I've decided to spray my armature outside, taking advantage of the nice weather. Even if you are outside, make sure to wear a face mask when you do this. Also, it's a good idea to wear a disposable glove in the hand you're holding the armature with. So what we're doing here is we're going over the whole armature, giving it a nice even coat of grey primer. Keep twisting the armature as you do it. This particular primer is a nice primer to use. It's available from Halfords, but any primer will probably do, providing it's not an etching primer. So keep twisting the armature as you spray. You want to get a nice even coat of grey on that. What you don't want to do is apply too much spray to one particular area, otherwise the paint will start to run. So keep twisting your armature. And once you're satisfied with your coat of paint, you can leave it outside to dry in the sun, providing it's not going to rain. Or if you do take it inside to dry, just make sure you leave it somewhere where there's adequate ventilation.
If you've got this far, thanks for watching my first ever YouTube video. If you've liked it, check out my next video, which will be the final chapter in a new approach to modelling trees. In that video, I'm going to be adding texture to my armature, adding the seafoam to my armature, and finally adding the final touches, painting the main trunk and branches, adding some growing ivy, adding the leaves, and finally we're adding a small bird's nest to our tree. If you've enjoyed my video, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. A list of materials I've used for this video and materials I'll be using for the next video is listed below the video. Please post a comment on YouTube, or if you prefer, email me at modellingtrees@gmail.com.